All right, the
You were saying?
musical three universals. What are those? What were you saying?
There's one I hear sometimes. Well, okay, the big three universals that people always say to me, at least when I'm doing interviews as an ethnographer, is like three things are endless. The sky is endless, the sea is endless, and stupidity is endless. So we go carefully through our interviews from that point on. I've heard fiddlers sometimes do, since you're asking about, is there one about horse head fiddles, which I don't actually know there to be one. There's certainly not one in Baldwin, but one that I've heard in interviews with fiddlers is like the defraying boasting, right? If I say, you're one of the great fiddlers, like, how does it feel? I've had a couple people say, a foolish man praises himself, an unfoolish man praises his wife, and the least foolish man praises his horse. So, of the fiddle, that's kind of a bit of the humility that comes through.
Excellent. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Anna, do you want
So
to
I
start
think
us
with
off?
that, yes, I think with that I'll do the intro. Thank you for that, Kip. This is the Great State Mural, Mongolia Portrayed, our bi-weekly podcast that analyzes the current developments and deepest structures of the joys of contemporary Mongolia. My name is Ethnomusicologist. I'm a journalist based in Ulaanbaatar.
And this is Julian Dirkes, and I am based at the University of Mannheim in Germany. Dolgon is not here today, but we have a guest. Oh,
Yes.
there's three of us again, as
Yeah.
often.
Yeah.
But before we jump into our conversation with Kip, just a couple little bits of housekeeping. We are recording video for the first time, and that's because when we met some listeners in Ulaanbaatar some weeks ago, we had requests for video that surprised us, but nevertheless, we're complying with our audience's wishes. And so we'll try that out. Just as a reminder to our listeners, do subscribe, do review, do all those good things. If you want to keep track of episodes as they're released, if you happen not to be subscribing to podcasts, there always is the webpage at agulamedia.com/podcast/podcast, where we list the episodes by topics and in sort of chronological order. And we also started posting them on LinkedIn a month or so ago. And in fact, to my surprise, LinkedIn is taking on more of an information medium than one might think, and not just for self-congratulatory AI postings, but also for posting about episodes. And so that's another place that you can subscribe if you want to keep track of things. But then if we go for it, Anand?
Yeah, and also for this episode, we do have 3 other episodes that's posted on YouTube, and this will be a continuation of that posting on YouTube, and I'll probably post our other back-end catalogs to YouTube also for our YouTube listeners.
Okay, fantastic. So then let's get into it with our guest today. We are going to talk about horses and music. And look, because we have a podcast, I can show you Kip's book. Look here. I've got it right here with my university library stand beam. So this is what we want to talk about. Kip Hutchins' book called A Song for the Horses. Kip, who are you?
Well, hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. My name's Kip Grosvenor Hutchins. I'm a visiting assistant professor in anthropology and sometimes environmental studies at Oberlin College. And I'm a music anthropologist, so I write ethnography based on the ways that people use music in their social life. Specifically, this book, A Song for the Horses, was my attempt to see all of the ways that I could in which Mongolian musicians play this traditional fiddle, which I call the horse fiddle, is conventionally referred to as the horse head fiddle in English, not only for themselves, but to interact with non-human animals and other non-human entities as well, mountains and ghosts. And as the research went on, the category got more capacious. And so that's kind of, in a nutshell, who I am academically, intellectually.
What's the difference between music anthropologist and music ethnocologist?
Yeah, so right in the U.S. academia, we have a kind of a split between music anthropology and what we refer to as ethnomusicology,
No,
and
that's I got it the wrong way around. Thank you. Yeah.
there's like a there's a disciplinary difference in that anthropology is social science and ethnomusicology is a humanity. So there's more of a focus in ethnomusicology on on art criticism of like unpacking the music, whereas like my work is more zoomed out, I guess I would say. Like, you don't need to know a lot about music to be able to understand what I'm trying to say about it. So that split we sort of refer to sometimes as music as culture versus music in culture, where what I'm doing is looking at what the kind of what roles music fills and how people feel about it. Whereas
Okay,
like
interesting.
contemporaries like Peter Marsh or Charlotte Devlin, who also work on the Horse Head Fiddle and the ethnomusicology side, get a lot deeper into the sounds of the instrument and the actual artistry that goes into it, and they have more of a fine-tuned ability to kind of appreciate that side of it. Whereas mine's a little bit my musicology cred is a little blunt. Like I say, like this song sounds nice, and then talk about it as a material thing. But
How, how did you get into like horse head fiddles, like Morin Khuur specifically, maybe?
yeah, this was I just sort of fell into it. I had started taking Mongolian in undergrad at Indiana University when I started there because I wanted to learn a language that I'd never heard spoken before. I didn't realize at the time that my teacher, Teren Legden, who's still there teaching now, was the only college level Mongolian language teacher in the United States at the time. That might still be true. Uh, and so that town has a Tibetan Buddhist monastery, has a really strong Mongolian community. So I just kind of got swept from this idle intellectual curiosity into a really vibrant community. And so when I went to Mongolia for the first time, it was through the American Center for Mongolian Studies language grant. And it was basically like nobody was applying for it. So it was easy to get.
When
And
was
so I
this?
went to Mongolia. This would have been 2010 when I first went to Mongolia. And my friend, another ethnomusicologist, great French ethnomusicologist, Joanie Courtet, who I met there that summer, said, "Hey, like you play cello, you play," and my mom plays viola da gamba. My mom's a professional cellist and viola da gamba player, and he's like, "You play cello, you know about viola da gamba? Have you heard of the Morin Khuur? And do you want to learn it?" And I was like, "Sure, why not?" Just I had nothing else to do other than go to language classes. So he hooked me up with my horse fiddle teacher as a student, just because there's this kind of through line, like when Mongolian orchestras play like Western pieces or Russian pieces, like Tchaikovsky pieces, the horse fiddle can fill the cello or the viola role, and so and it's played a lot like a viola da gamba. Viola da gamba and horse fiddle are both non-end pin instruments, so you have to hold them up with your legs. They're both underhand instead of overhand, so very different from cello or violin. So there's a lot of stuff I was really just kind of familiar with, but going into it, the sound really, the more you like spend time in Mongolia, the more the sound of the horse fiddle really comes through as iconically the Mongolian sound in a way of the Mongolian instruments. So,
Can you maybe,
and
before we move on, maybe, can you maybe describe the horse head fiddle for maybe people who don't
sure,
know what the horse head fiddle is? You described the cello and then other like fiddle
sure.
instruments, but they're a little bit different from those. So can you
Yeah,
describe that?
so the horse fiddle is really unique in the grand class of like fiddle-like instruments. It's a spike fiddle, which is a category of fiddles that we usually find in traditional music in North Asia. So saha, the Kazakh kobuz. These are other instruments where the neck of the fiddle descends into the body. We have a long, thin neck that at the top has a peg box, which is carved with a horse's head, which is where we get the English term. The English term is actually a translation of the neologism from Japanese ethnomusicology, and as you all know, Morin Khuur really more accurately translates to like horse fiddle or horse's fiddle. But we have that term because the peg box is always carved into the shape of a horse, sometimes with a dragon at the bottom of its neck, from which two thick bundles of horsehair descend. So we have a two-string instrument, has basically more or less 3-octave range, and these thick bundles being loosely bound rather than tightly wound means that we get this a range of very clear, in some cases very haunting notes, but on the other side of the kind of timbre chasm here, we also have really coarse, harmonic, heavy, very full, complicated sound texture that's possible, and horse and fiddle players avail themselves of this duality very well, and in order to kind of create this really complicated sonic environment with just two strings, the construction of the fiddle really helps with that. Rather than pressing the strings down onto the neck, which is very like the way that you would play a guitar, violin, almost any other string instrument that you can think of, there's about an inch of clearance between the strings and the neck. And so, in order to play it, you have to push the strings to the side. Or in Western Mongolia, there's some playing techniques where you pull from the other side. But in either way, rather than pushing down, you're changing the tone on the string by pushing the string to the side or very lightly touching it to create a pretty wide range of harmonics. And this is like very unique. I mean, people sometimes refer to it as the air fiddle for that reason in like musicology circles, because you never cut off the air between the strings and the neck, and lends itself to this really a sound that could either go really ethereal or very, very horsey, because by not constraining the string, it stays really the timbre, the sound character can stay really complicated.
How interesting. So you're not pushing the string onto the neck you would be with a typical string instrument otherwise, yeah? You said to the side, and so it's lengthening the string? That's what's making the change sound?
Yeah, I mean, it's operating on the same principle, right? Which is that you make effectively when you play a string instrument, in order to make the note higher, you make the string shorter. And you do this with the horse and fiddle by pressing it on the side, but it leaves enough of this kind of loose kind of bundlingness of it that multiple parts of the string can resound at once. So that's like pretty unique. I haven't really come across other instruments that do this. I mean, there may be other spike fiddles in the Mongolic world that have a similar thing, or there are other fiddles in the Mongolic world, like the Khur, which is a supersized horse head fiddle with a camel head carved into the top, that is in between like the horse head fiddles kind of medium range and the really deep range of something like an ikhur, which is like the stand-up upright bass version.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
I haven't heard about the Shagahor at all as a Mongolian, actually.
They're super rare. My teacher that I work with, or used to work with in Dongoif province, had one, and we spent 10 years trying to find it because he loaned it out to someone and it disappeared. And it was like a big frustration for the people I work with. We're like, what do you mean you gave it away? It's like one of the only ones left in the country. But yeah, we never were able to find it. So if anyone can find Shanagonhor, I'm on the lookout for it.
Wow.
Very cool.
So you're basically saying that there isn't a lot of people who can play that instrument also. Is that right?
Well, there's a category of Mongolian instruments that were all originally one instrument. That, like, in Haslund Christensen, we have, like, recordings of herders putting horsehair strings on ladles and then and then using a knife as the bridge in, like, prehistory, or pre-modern Mongolia, to either play as a kind of bowed fiddle, like what we have as the horse fiddle today, or as, like, a plucked lute, in the form of like what we have as the tobshor, which is kind of a Mongolian banjo, equivalent, and it's widely played by throat singers. So with the Morin Khuur, it's as far as I understand, it's tuned to one of the non-standard tunings of the Horse Head Fiddle. But if you can play the Morin Khuur, you could probably play the Morin Khuur. Like, it's bowed the same. Pressing on the side or pulling from the side is the same. It's just deeper. It has a deeper range and has a longer neck, so it might be a little awkward. But there are a lot of fiddles in pre-modern Mongolia. Before it was standardized in the 1970s, there were like fiddles that had heads of Buddhist demons, or the Chanmanerten, the three gems of knowledge in Mongolian Buddhism. One I've seen a record of, but I've never seen the carving of, is called the Matarzugi, which is like Leviathan bee. Another one I've been really relentlessly searching for. That all got standardized into horse in the middle of the 20th century, and this is all from Peter Marsh's book on cosmopolitan reimagination of the Horse Head Fiddle. So there, and with the different heads, there are various different sizes. That some of them remain to this day in museums. Some of them are just in rural herders' houses. That kind of standard, like 3-octave range, that's pretty new in terms of construction of the instrument. Traditionally, it'd be tuned to the voice of the singer. So you'd make a bigger one if you had a deeper voice. You'd make a littler one for a higher range, that kind of thing.
Oh, what a great start, and lots to learn, I think, for all of us anyway, of things that you know already. If we get towards the book a little bit, to me, there's two big substantive streams in the book. The one is focused on the Morin Khuur, on the Horse Head Fiddle itself, and the other one is the human-animal interactions that the fiddle plays a role with. I think, for the most part, we imagine that our listeners have a connection to Mongolia and so have the sound in mind, but probably many of them, the international listeners, but even some of the Mongolians, to me, the Horse Head Fiddle is a moment to enjoy an instrument, right? It brings the pleasure of listening to live music. But the second stream in your book makes the music somewhat more purposeful and not just to enjoyment. Now, there's lots of music elsewhere in the world that has political, religious purposes or all kinds of other purposes that are removed from just, hey, I like this melody. But talk a little bit about, if purpose might not be the right terminology for you, but the role that the Horse Head Fiddle plays, particularly in the countryside for herders, that is somewhat, in addition to or removed from that enjoyment purpose.
Yeah, so when I started this project, a million years ago, I asked a bunch of professional horse fiddlers, what kind of book should I write? What do you think would be interesting to read about? What should I study? And most of the people that I talked to back then said, if you want to understand the horse fiddle, then you need to know something about horses. That is an interesting kind of place to start for musicians, especially, I mean, these are professional musicians based out of the conservatories and orchestras and stuff, not people who interact with horses on a day-to-day basis, but people for whom horses have had this really significant role in developing their artistic identities. So that's what got me interested in it. And when you start with the relationship between the Horse Head Fiddle and horses, there's, at the kind of a base level, a way that the horse fiddle creates a relationship between people and horses, even just to be playable at all, that horse fiddle performers have a variety of ways of kind of visualizing this connection. The strings of the horse fiddle have to be changed if the horse that provided them passes away. So there are people who act as sources for strings to, like, even relatively large scale kind of industrial horse and fiddle production will let the people they supply know, so that everybody can change their strings. The idea being that this living connection between the human and horse is what makes the instrument sound right. It gives it a certain kind of sound, and fiddlers refer to this as the suns, which literally means ghost. And I have a whole chapter about the myriad ways that people interpret this, but it's at its heart an appreciation for the kind of relationship between humans and horses that goes into making this music sound good. And on the output end, there is a pretty wide variety of the use of music as a herding tool in rural Mongolia. This is the kind of thing that isn't exactly unique to Mongolia. Like, people do sing to their sheep while milking or to their cattle in various parts around the world. But what is unique is that in Mongolia, there is this well elaborated rural intellectual tradition around what the role of music is, how to use music as a herding practice, what it does, and so the performances that you get can be relatively elaborate. I mean, the really famous one, and the one big case where you see the horse fiddle be used in rural Mongolia as a herding tool, is in cases where camel mothers will reject their calves, there's a 2004 docudrama called Story of the Weeping Camel that outlines this kind of arc. Camels are very human-like in a way. They play pranks, they joke, and they experience things like postpartum depression and separation, and will reject their calves pretty often. Anybody who's like spent time with a rural Gobi like herding family has the experience of going out on a dirt bike and bringing back one of like a big camel calf like around your arms to try to figure out whose calf is this. So it happens all the time, and it's the kind of thing where the one primary tool, at least in the Gobi, for getting the mother and calf back together is playing the fiddle. And iconically, the camel will cry real tears. It's very the first time I saw that was really challenging to my worldview. That like this camel's listening to music, is crying tears. They bring the calf up, the calf starts to nurse. The process of nursing rebinds them together, and you can safely release them back into the Gobi, where you can now trust that the mother is going to take care of the child and not leave it out somewhere. There are a lot of theories as to why this kind of thing works that I talk about in chapter 3 of my book, but at a kind of a fundamental level, this use of musicality for its ability to calm or energize non-human animals, whether it's singing songs to horses before a race, singing the gingo before a race to get them like pumped up, or singing a kind of lullaby version of a long song to a sheep to encourage it to adopt a recently orphaned lamb from a different sheep. These are things that really run through the music, and they feed back on the music at every level. So you go and see the Mongolian Horse Head Fiddle Ensemble. Some of those fiddlers are going to have learned songs in the countryside from people who are like playing for the camels to make them cry, or playing for mountains as a form of a kind of nature veneration in the Mongolian kind of custom, or playing in ways that create a kind of environment that is that's peaceful, that's nice. It's not just accessible to humans, but ideally is accessible to horses, to the landscape, and to other kind of more than natural or more than human beings.
Fascinating. There goes my cuckoo clock making its appearance in the podcast. If you can hear that, another human-animal interaction.
Yeah.
Although it's a little plastic cuckoo.
Well, the cuckoo is a very famous sound in Mongolia. The cuckoo bird is an omen.
It is
a portent, and is widely featured in Mongolian traditional music, especially music of the tsur, which is an overtone flute.
And you can hear it in the north more than the Gobi, right? But you hear the cuckoo occasionally. You've talked a little bit already about the connection specifically to horses and then to camels, but on the piece about horses, as an uneducated in musicology listener, one of the striking things about the Morin Khuur is how good it is at imitating horse sounds. And most striking and easily picked out is galloping hooves and neighing in many ways. Is it that the fiddlers choose to make horse sounds, or is the instrument actually well suited to make horse sounds? If that can even be distinguished.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of both. It's definitely an instrument that lends itself to horse sounds because it has this complicated timbre. And so, if you're doing something like you're mimicking or doing a mimetic performance of natural sounds, like the more complicated texture that you have available to you, the more different kinds of sounds you can create. But this is also, a skill of Mongolian artistry. This is like a feature of Mongolian music education. So if you listen to, I just played this in class, actually, in 2 different classes this week. The Bayan Mongol Variety Group, which was in the 1980s Mongolia's like state socialist funk band. They have a version of Jalanhar, which is a Mongolian neoclassical composition that is based on these traditional fiddle tunes. And they do a whinny with the trumpets. They keep the horse beat with an electric guitar. They take this horse fiddle tune where all of these roles would be played on the Morin Khuur, and they kind of dole it out to different instruments. And I think this is like one of these areas where it kind of John Sonarov, the composer and music theorist, would say that like there's like a Mongolian like musicological theory basically that underpins a lot of the horse and fiddle and other traditional instruments composition and teaching that that Mongolian musicians are really good at applying in other instruments or in other sectors, partially due to this kind of appreciation, this total sonic appreciation for like what the rural nomadic soundscape is capable of producing. So you have like you have this kind of stuff. Like I fully believe that an expert horse and fiddle player could make a horse sound on any instrument, more or less, given enough time. Because of the artistic sensibility that the genre kind of requires you to have.
Is there any? I would like to ask like I think a lot of modern people know about the Mongolian band Who, and I read an article of what was it like the how Mongolia used its own instrument, utilizing its own traditional instruments and weaving it into like modern instrument. Does that is that true of like maybe like the Morin Khuur, that it's very like versatile in a way that it can be used in any like rock music and other types of musical genres?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like, despite the fact that there are only 2 strings, only 3 octaves, so there's not a lot of pitches that you can play on it. There's only so many notes you can play on it. The other side of it is that you have access to a lot of kinds of sound, so it's adaptable in a lot of ways, like to different moods and different genres. It can be really coarse, it can be really heavy. With an electric pickup, it can be, it carries a lot of the kind of overwhelming capacity that something like a high distortion guitar can have. But on the other side, it can be very, very clear and very sentimental in a way that lends itself to things like ballads or, it figures into pop music and rap music as well in various different iterations. So it is pretty adaptable. I mean, the Who is an interesting case because in a way, like the Who is kind of the brainchild of Badamjargal Bachav, who's a Mongolian musicologist, and his idea with that was in the early 1970s. Che Loroydamb, the Minister of Culture and a famous novelist of the Mongolian 20th century, basically was charged by the government to come up with a solution to people liking the Beatles. So he took a bunch of Lap Zither Yatuk professors, gave them electric instruments, and told them, make a Mongolian psychedelic rock band, and that's where we get this band Soil Erden. And Soil Erden did the opposite kind of that the Who is doing, where they had Western instruments and they took things like the Ballad of Toray Band, this like famous Southeast Mongolian gunfighter ballad, or Jahan Sharak, which is another song from the Toray Band kind of ecosystem, a long song, and put them on these Western instruments, made them into psychedelic rock songs. And so, Badamjargal Bachav was like, we can do this going the other way. got one of the guys from Hurt, famous Mongolian hard rock band from the 80s, and got a bunch of flute professors from the National Conservatory and said, we'll kind of do this in a different way. Take Mongolian instruments and Mongolian like melodies, and the what we refer to in musicology as the Tuva Mongolia mode, which is a kind of pentatonic scale with the notes arranged in a certain way that's kind of iconic to composition in North Asia, and make like rock songs that fit around the electric horse head fiddle, the electric topshor, overtone flute. That I think, it took a lot of thinking. It took a lot of like collective compositional power. But you can hear in that band or other bands that have done similar things like Altan Oruk, which went kind of big in the US in the early 2000s, doing like the music for the Marco Polo series and the movie Mongol and stuff, of like taking these sounds that are otherwise pretty alien to Western music, like the ewerbure, this like kind of microtonal clarinet kind of instrument, and the horse head fiddle itself, which can be a tough instrument to kind of get your hands around to start with, and making them really communicable to things like rock music or especially rock, I guess I would say. I mean, there's some pop and rap as well. The Mongolian pop artist Bold famously had a run where he was trying to make, quote, Mongol pop a thing, and he has a series of albums that are like completely full of horse head fiddle, and some of that is pretty successful of fitting that fiddle into a pop idiom. There's a Buryat artist who's... Oh, this is gonna bother me if I can't remember her name, but she came out with a song called Erbet Sohor, which is a Mongolian folk tune, and that's like in like electro pop with her horse head fiddle performance, or like Arctic pop, I guess we could say. That's very good.
Are they called Otukan or something? Or no?
This is Aryuna Nimaeva. Aryuna Nimaeva is this Buryat singer. And there were people who were kind of doing Arctic electro-pop with Mongolian themes in the Buryat Republic for a long time, like Namgar, for example, is a big name in the kind of that canon.
All right, enough talk about music. Will you make some music, Kip?
Okay, I'll try. I've got my fiddle here, so I have a variety of caveats to make, which is that I need to replace the strings. They're quite old, so it'll sound bad. And I'm very out of practice, and I'm also an anthropologist, which another big distinction between anthropologists and ethnomusicologists is that anthropologists don't really have to be good at anything. So I'm not very good at it.
Maybe before you play, can you maybe like show the whole body of the horse head fiddle for us?
Yeah, so okay. Horse's head carving with the two big pegs, which we call the chich, the ears of the instrument. This one has this is like conventionally referred to in the carving of the instrument as the dragon head, but the dragon head category is pretty wide ranging. So this one's a Leviathan matar. As far as the story goes, the dragon head was added during the Qing Empire to like demonstrate the tributary status of the horse of Mongolia, of Outer Mongolia, and the like outer domains to the Qing Emperor. I'm like not sure if that's true or not, but that's a story that I've heard a bunch of times. But people still like it to this day. And then we've got this clearance here between the strings. You fit your whole finger underneath. Very long neck, and then the conventional typical body now is trapezoidal. There's a range of body types that exist before the kind of standardization of the instrument, but a trapezoidal body with holes on the sides of the body and a leather or snakeskin top is very typical for the traditional form of the instrument, and people still play that. It has a very soft sound. It doesn't translate very well to concert performance, and you can't take them outside of Mongolia because they'll collapse in non-arid ecosystems. So this wooden body with the front-facing holes, that's kind of the standard for professional performance. And then we've got this bridge, and this is another space that I like. This is a minute detail, but I'm a big fan of it, Bridges of horsehead fiddles are often conventionally carved into the faces of demons from Buddhist iconography, which I just think is neat. No, there's no reason for it necessarily.
Last question before you start: is the strings made of horse
Yeah.
tail hair?
Yeah, so there'll be horse tail strings. Actually, if you go to like a rural encampment, the strings will be black typically, because they're actually typically taken from horses with black tail. I mean, black is a very common mane and tail color that is across a lot of different pelages. So it's funny, like this, the bows and strings of the instrument, all horsetail. In fact, like the horsetail that goes into things like violin bows, like something like 90 or more % of it comes from Mongolia as well. But
Really? Okay.
with this kind of like standard construction instrument, the strings are bleached and kind of it's like less obviously horsetail, but it still very much sounds like it. And it's horsetail and horsetail, so the bow's also horsetail.
Yeah.
And now
Well,
you're
one
waxing
thing I-
it, or what are you doing?
Yeah, so the thing about horsetail and horsetail is it takes a lot of rosin. So I've got my rosin. There's actually, in my book, there's a story that a Mongolian fiddler told me. It was a creation myth of the fiddle, one of the other creation myths that's less commonly told. That's like, the Buddha created this instrument, but it sounded awful, so he sent it to the underworld to Erle Khan, who is a kind of figure in both Tibetan Buddhism and Mongolian traditional religion as a kind of underworld figure. And he was like, well, I know the problem. It doesn't have anything from the earth. And he creates rosin out of one of the trees of the underworld and sends it back. And then it sounds good. And so it's a little collaboration. The moral of the story being that, like, there are two strings on the fiddle. There are two streams in life. There is good and there is evil, but you have to have it in balance in order to have something beautiful. And that's one of our kind of one of the only creation myths of the fiddle that includes rosin, despite it having a pretty central role in performance. Let's see. And I gotta make sure I can, maybe I'll back up a little bit, see about having it be in tune. It's still pretty much in tune. Alrighty, let's see what I remember. Gotta get in soon. Okay.
Yay, bravo. And we've got a react button here, so clapping and suing. Fantastic, Kip, very cool.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a Jonang Har. Jonang Hara is an interesting song. It's a very old song. It's a style called Tatlagan Ayats, or sometimes casually called Tatluk, which is horse gait mimicry. And Jonang, really widespread. Every province in Mongolia has a Jonang variant, and within every province there are Jonang variants that are specific to different fiddlers. So this is one I learned from my teacher, M. Ganbold, who is the fiddle half of the band Altai Hongai. He's the Altai half of Altai Hongai, along with Nerwin Ganzarek, who's the throat singer. And so that's my version. There are versions in the Gobi. There are two versions in the Gobi that I've heard, that I know, that are very, very different. And you hear like big folk rock versions of it too. Like the band Jonang has a Jonang Har, and it's like one of my favorite Mongolian songs of all time. And it's about a black horse. It's about the ambling, or gamboling, the typical pace that Mongolian horses do, that Western horses pretty much don't, outside of Icelandic draft horses and Tennessee high steppers, where there's a diagonal alternation of the hooves. So that's what we're trying to kind of imagine here as we hear it.
Very cool.
Thank you, Kip.
There's a whole shift, or one of the ambitious things you try to do in the book that I enjoyed so much is that you try to make this connection between heritage and futures, right? And it's in the subtitle already, with musical heritage for more than human futures. And in some ways, I read it as you partly asking the question, as herding and as the countryside is not necessarily disappearing, but is receding in prominence in, the national imaginary of Mongolia, but also in economic prominence in other ways, right? What role does this heritage then play in the future? And the countryside disappearing is partly an ecological phenomenon and partly a modernization, economic development, and so forth. So what does happen? How does this musical heritage and the focus on countryside and the connection to herding practices, what happens when the countryside disappears?
Yeah, so I asked I have a very anodyne question that I ask in some of my interviews. That's like, where do you see? Because my background originally is in education, so my original research question was like, how is this taught and learned? And so I used to ask people like, okay, where do you see this instrument that you play or this genre that you teach in 30 years or whatever? And I asked one person this question, and she was like, oh, are you asking what happens after the countryside goes away? Basically, like, are you asking what happens after the world ends for country people like me? And I was like, not asking that, but was really interested in that outlook because she seemed really like equanimous about it. Like it was something that she was worried about, aware of, but it wasn't like really afraid of necessarily. And her outlook on it was like climate crisis and economic crisis and like
Land
exploitation crisis, are gonna make it so that nomadism doesn't stay the same, and that maybe nomadism has that there's a potential like end of the world for nomads in certain cases, or like in her case, right? That she's aware of and worried about, but it's like I have this tendency. I'm from the United States, I'm from rural Southern Appalachia. When I hear about apocalypse, that's like very final to me. But from her perspective, as thinking in a kind of Buddhist cyclical time, or thinking through other kind of Mongolian local philosophical ways of thinking about time, she was like, hey, the end of the world is like it's not the end of everything necessarily. Like we've had the world end before. That like, for rural people, for nomads world over, and for people in Mongolia, like it's a chain of world-ending events that go like the purges, which killed a higher percentage of people in Mongolia than anywhere else in the Soviet Union, and then before that is the integration into the Qing Empire, which led to these mass hunts that eventually would lead to the die out of the Siberian red deer. So now there's like 200 deer left in Mongolia, and like the die out of the Przewalski's horse, which had to be brought back from extinction in the latter half of the 20th century, and all this other like ecologically transformative stuff. And then there's like the Tibetan Buddhist Empire, which radically transformed relations. And then even like for some people, like the onset of the Mongol Empire was the end of the world that existed before it and the beginning of a world that comes after. So like the thing then is, what do you do to prepare for the world as you know it to end in such a way that you continue to exist, persist, and have sovereignty afterwards? Sovereignty being a huge concern for Mongolians right now, as people in southern Mongolia, the northern part of China, are like experiencing really radical threats to their cultural sovereignty in the form of like the change in education that makes it so that you can't get primary education in Mongolian anymore. And so, Mongolian people on both sides of the border and in Russia are really concerned with like, okay, the world that like, everything gets blamed on Genghis Khan, right? But the one thing the Mongol Empire didn't invent that the other empires did was climate change. And so like the world that the nomads have is really dependent on the environment, and the world that the nomads made is not inherently destructive towards it. So we can recreate a world after this one ends that's recreates all the destructive tendencies of like Western imperialism or like neoliberal like hollowing out of public and geological resources, or make a world that is more in line with nomadic ways of thought. But in order to do that, you kind of have to smuggle nomadic ways of thought into modernity, into post-modernity, and through this apocalypse in the way that people smuggled their songs and the large bodies of knowledge that came with them through the Great Purges, which is something that there's a story about that at the end of my book in chapter 6, I think. So we have a tendency to think of heritage, and heritage is in a big way a form of past mastering, a form of creating the past. But the tendency to think teleologically, the past is in the past, the future is in the future, those two things are different, is basically like, Christian thought or Western thought. And it's not Mongolian thought necessarily. There are Mongolians who think like this, but it's not inherent to Mongolian philosophies, right? That there are other ways of thinking, there are nomadic ways of thinking that are cyclical, where the past and the future can be the same thing, such that these past mastering exercises, like figuring out how to do heritage in a way that's responsible to the environment and responsive to the needs of non-humans, is also kind of building a playbook for surviving on a planet in which those relationships are even more fragile than they are now, like a desertified Gobi, a every 2 years old winter disaster steppe, an eastern steppe where like new climate problems come up every year, or like an Ulaanbaatar that just basically grew a rainy season out of nowhere. It has an extra like fifth season now in the middle of summer. So like those are all vulnerabilities and precarities. How do you build a resilience to that doesn't reproduce the problems that caused those precarities in the first place? And for the people I work with, it's drawing on the nomadic parts, drawing on the pastoral heritage that doesn't encode climate violence in the way that our other approaches to modernity very clearly do, demonstrably do.
I love, yeah, I love how you give connection to like our way of life with the music and our way of life in nomadism, connecting that, because I think a lot of Mongolians don't really understand that factor a lot. Even as a person who as a journalist who tries to cover a lot of the climate disasters that are happening in Mongolia, a lot of Mongolians are very much apathetic towards what is happening outside of our small little city. And I'm very grateful that you can bridge that gap between like of music and our way of life in the countryside, basically. And even as a person who I feel like I kind of know some of these things. I was fascinated about the stories you told about about the giant camel fiddle, and also about Irlich, which I'd never heard of before, even as a Mongolian. I think a lot of Mongolians take those things for granted. Yeah, go ahead, Julian. That was just my overall comment on the thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of coming to the end of the conversation, which is befitting because this topic about the heritage and the futures is what ends the book as well, and it's really I quite enjoyed reading those pieces to also help me think about the place of nomadism and the symbolic importance that I see, for example, in politics or so, and put that in their context. Really helpful and interesting in that way. There's one thing that I want to ask before we finish here, and that's throughout the book and even now in a lot of your answers, you make a lot of references to various teaching relationships, and there are the various sort of institutions of the horse fiddle, the conservatory, the national ensemble, but you also talked about fiddlers who learn in the countryside as opposed to others. And so one of the things I'm curious more directly is what does the learning or the teaching of the fiddle look like today? How does, because some of the members of the National Orchestra are young, they're student age, right? How do they come to be fiddlers, and how are they imagining their future and their interaction with music? So this whole complex of education and teaching I'd be really interested in because it keeps coming up.
Yeah, I mean there's a big concern for fiddle professors now. The director of the Horse Head Fiddle ensemble, Hustai, is like very clear. Like there are two strings to the fiddle. There are two methods of learning. This is what you need to do to be a professional horse fiddle player, which is to learn through the conservatory track and have a high level of professionalism in the kind of Western. I mean, it's post-Soviet, so it's like French via Russian institutional education that was adapted to the horse and fiddle by a cellist / modern horn player named Jamian in the middle of the 20th century. And then in Inner Mongolia, there's an equivalent at the same time named Shipaluk, who's doing the same. He's also a cello horse and fiddle player. And so there's that one side where it's like you got to be Tchaikovsky style trained, and then the other side is you have to know. You have to do these pastoral kind of learning techniques where in pre-modern Mongolia, traditionally, you wouldn't be allowed to play a fiddle tune unless you could play it all the way through to start with. So formal education in that context takes the form of basically like secret mimicry. You would borrow a fiddle from an older relative and take it out to the field and practice songs that you had heard or seen played until you could pretty well do it all the way through one time, and then you could be taught songs directly. But that means that you have to learn a lot of aesthetic appreciation, that you have to have a really deep musicological relationship with the instrument based on the sounds of the wind over the steppe, horses and camels and cattle over different landscapes, and the way that those kind of feed into Mongolian acoustic aesthetics. So there's a lot of learning in the pasture that at least the Horse Head Fiddle ensemble would prefer that you have. Now, that being said, like, if you're in the conservatory track starting at 5 years old, which is very possible for a lot of people, you live in Ulaanbaatar. I mean, when I taught English in Ulaanbaatar, most of my students had never seen a horse in person, right? They had maybe seen one from afar during like Nottam or something, but they hadn't touched them. They couldn't ride, right? Like there's a young generation, right? And like, people my age and younger who are just from the democratic era, the neoliberal era or whatever have you, don't have formal institutions in place that send kids to the countryside and on scale, or send fiddle performers on scale like they did in the socialist period. Like in the socialist period, fiddlers would be sent to the countryside to do like education campaigns and stuff like that, and they learn a lot of fiddle tunes. A lot of the cattle tunes that we have are like from periods like that, where fiddlers just informally learned from rural fiddlers, brought it into the professional canon because the government was paying for them to go to rural Ulf's province. So fiddle teachers now, most of whom did both, people who are like middle-aged and older, who maybe grew up in the countryside or had grandparents in the countryside and learned a lot of the traditional fiddle tunes in the old way or the nomadic way, are teaching students who don't have an ability to have that connection directly, and it's something that they're working to kind of overcome it in a variety of ways. And I have a chapter about the various ways that like they try to overcome it. It's kind of an ambivalent response to this, in that some of it seems to work and some of it doesn't seem to work, and there isn't a clear answer to this problem. But the division between urban and rural in this case is something that needs to be mitigated for somebody to be considered a holistic fiddler. That being said, like, they're really excellent fiddlers who are not interested in that at all and who are just really technically proficient. That like you wouldn't tell him like, hey, what's up, first chair of the Horse Head Fiddle ensemble? You don't sound like you know how to ride a horse. But that being said, that's a concern that teachers take with them. So the degree to which students take it seriously is there's a range of it. There's some students who are like, I don't care, I'm just going to be really great, and those students often end up really great. But a lot of them will go to the countryside on their own and try to learn from horses, like working as ranch hands and stuff. I've had plenty of cases of students just disappearing from the conservatory track for like 6 months to a year, and then coming back with this new canon of like camel songs, having spent that time in the Gobi with a herding family. And by and large, fiddle professors think that's cool. Like they're generally like, oh great, that's cool, awesome, that's so good. Not like, where have you been? Where are you derelict in your duties or whatever. It kind of works like that.
And then instead of our usual Mergen take, I would propose that we finish with a bit of music, no?
Yeah, but before that, I have one question. Maybe do you think it's because of all the like the rote kind of learning that we have in Mongolia, where you just have to learn it, and like you described so much history, so much lore behind our horsehead fiddle, which I'd never heard. And sometimes I interviewed horsehead fiddlers, they never talk about those kind of things. Do you think that might be the issue of some people are not tuning in or like giving up the instrument?
I do think that there is, and this is not unique to Mongolia necessarily, but it is something I've noticed, that there is a lot of like cultural pessimism in Mongolia, or at least in Ulaanbaatar, which love UB, spent many winters in UB. I consider myself a real fan of the city, but in Ulaanbaatar especially, there is this kind of sense of there's a kind of a culture, and maybe this is a young person thing that wears off eventually, that we have like wherever we have this where I'm from too, of like thinking of Mongolian culture as not being like as capacious as it is, of thinking of Mongolian culture in a really kind of one-note way, where either people lean into it really heavily in ways that can not always be healthy, or more often look at that and say, oh, whatever, like Genghis Khan, horse archers, whatever, like that's not me, that's not my life, so why do I care about it? Or like it doesn't even make us look good internationally, so like whatever. And so you have like a lot of young people who like spend a lot of their youth speaking English and then end up kind of being in a weird interstitial space where their English ends up like as good as or maybe a little better than their Mongolian. A lot of people who like reflexively believe that horse fiddle music is going to be like really boring, or it's like for Tsagansar, which nobody really likes when they're young anyway. And so that's a culture of I know it's like kind of pessimistic. Like there's an idea, at least in UB, of like Mongolian culture has a dead end, basically, and it's not modern and it's not forward looking. It makes me feel really sad to hear, because if you look at it from the outside, and I think the reason why a lot of interviews, like why Mongolian fiddlers might not tell Mongolian interviewers a lot of this stuff, but they will tell me as a foreigner, is that looking from the outside coming in, Mongolia is intellectually, artistically, culturally an extremely rich country. The only country left in the world that is run according to a nomad political structure. The only country left in the world where nomads are not like relentlessly persecuted by settler colonial powers, whether it's like from Mali at war with the Tuaregs or the Russian situation with the Buryats and the Sakha. Like Mongolia is a singular, unique country that has a lot to add to the world. And whether we think of that in terms of like recontextualizing ancient history, or if we just look at like, here's what we've got today in, you know, in UB City or whatever that is unique and that is significant to the way that you live lives that are not fully sedentary. Almost nobody in Mongolia is fully sedentary. Very few people are fully nomadic, but a lot of people are partially nomadic. And the climate crisis era basically demands that you spend some of your time moving around. Everybody in the, and I personally think everybody in the world's going to have to be nomads at some point, because like, I mean, my hometown was washed away by floods. So like, and that's a part of the world in the inner Blue Ridge that before European settler colonization, people nomadized on it. People left the mountains during certain seasons. Cherokee left the mountains during certain seasons and came back. Climate crisis is going to add to that. And so like a country that's got this huge body of knowledge that is, I think, well adapted to the future, to a more arid future, to a future where water is more inconsistently coming down. That's, you know, that's Gobi futurism as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. I feel like at the moment of I feel like a lot of Mongols are being more proud of their culture now, because there was a time I remember like there was a lot of pessimism. People didn't like to wear our traditional garments. Now people adorn those, and maybe it's a little shallow in some ways, because you would see the Morin Khuur hanging up on their walls, but it's always dusty and nobody actually knows how to play it, and the strings are actually made of plastic. But again, I guess it's a maybe uh, like one step forward, maybe two steps back, but like there's some momentum forwards with that. But and I think with that, maybe like again, as Julian mentioned, let's not do like Megan takes. Maybe you can take us out with a song.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see what else I can remember. Let me see what else I got in my canon. You bring the instrument into a human environment. Keeping it in tune is a little bit of a struggle.
Fantastic. I was looking wistfully out my window at the horizon. Very nice. Kip, really terrific to talk to you. Listeners, go to your library, get a song for the horses, take a look. Lots to learn, as you heard today. Lots of interesting stories, lots of great fieldwork. Kip, along with Anand and I, is one of the few Mongolia-focused folks on BlueSky, the most Mongolian of social networks. Join us there if you like.
Thank you so much
today,
for
Kip. This has been great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun. And I always say this is my favorite thing to talk about. So if anybody wants to learn more, obviously my book, A Song for the Horses, is a good start. But you can also reach out to me, and I'll continue to talk at length. I mean, I don't think there is a possible endpoint, and I have been doing this for like 20 years almost. On what I'm willing to talk about with regards to the horse and fiddle or traditional music or what have you. So there's plenty more where that came from.
When's the Mongolian version of your book coming out to Mongolia?
I would love for there to be a Mongolian translation of my book, and I've been thinking about what it would take to get that. Yeah, I don't know, like, because I can't translate it. There's a lot actually in between when I started and now. The Mongolian anthropology kind of sector has really grown a lot. There's a lot of great anthropologists in Mongolia now. So I'm looking into if there's a grant or something I can apply for to get a translation by somebody who knows both the jargon and is more proficient, obviously, in Mongolian than I am. But I would love nothing more than for there to be a Mongolian translation of my book.
Listeners, a call to action. Thanks again,
right.
and
Yeah.
Julian signing off. We'll talk to you again in a future episode.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
This has been Anand from Mongolia. Thank you, Kip.
Thanks. And this is Kip. Bye.